Okay, at this time, I think we're going to debrief just a little bit, and I invite Matt forward and Bert forward. They're going to, as moderators, help me summarize some of the points associated with today's discussion. We're gonna sum those up kind of briefly, and then turn to the audience a little bit and see if you all have some summary points as well that go into the process. So, Matt, Bert, come on forward. Well, Bert, just make sure these mics are working. Let's start with you and see if you have a few observations, and Matt will go with you. We'll go with you next.
Okay. First off, I think it's important for me to say that Terry did not tell me I was going to have to think until after it was too late for me to think. So
get a better product that way.
So I think what he said earlier was, we'll give you an opportunity to correct us on all the stuff that we forgot, that we missed. But as I reflect back on the conversation and the questions and the discussions that we had during the enforcement panel, a couple of things came to mind. First is that every state has to do enforcement. There will be opportunities in every state for the state veterinarian's office to enforce those traceability animal health regulations. Most producers, if they're not aware that they're in compliance, once you have an opportunity, the field staff has an opportunity to sit down, visit with those people, they are perfectly willing to come into compliance. They want to do the right thing. That's true of the vast majority, I think, of livestock producers out there. There is the small minority that you have to slap them on the wrist once or twice, and then they understand why they have to come into compliance. And then a very small minority of producers who have absolutely no intention of coming into compliance. And those are the ones that you really, from an enforcement perspective, probably spend most of your time dealing with. But the enforcement, even though it varies from state to state, generally I got the sense that the states take a fairly soft approach. They will do everything they can to help a producer who is, or a veterinarian, and I also got the sense that a lot of the non-compliance issues come from how the veterinarians do or do not do a good job of filling out the CVIs. And so you sit down with that producer or you sit down with that veterinarian, go through even one-on-one kind of education, and oftentimes you can solve the problem before you reach the point of actually having to do any sort of heavy-handed enforcement. And panelists, if I'm missing some of the major points that you think are important, by all means jump in here. Bridging the gap, we're seeing increased use of RFID tags, but largely I think the panel agreed that use is from a management perspective, or to as more and more cattle become what we call program cattle. As producers get into a value-added kind of a program that requires third-party authorization or verification or any number of management reasons why that EID tag would be important to you. But we heard this morning the sponsors in the back of the room say that most of those EID tags, when they are bought, are not bought with an 840 number on them. And so a lot of discussion about how do you bridge that gap. How do you make it important in the producer's mind that you have that 840 number, you have that premise ID, and you just do that at the very beginning, at the place of birth, and then many of your problems are already taken care of. As Dr. Haas pointed out, but she is by no means alone in this problem, independence is a pretty strong attribute amongst cattle producers, and they really just don't like being told what they need to do. staffing is an issue, both at the state and federal level. And it has some discussion about, at the state level, the state veterinarian's office can't enforce federal regulations. All you can do is enforce state regulations. So when you get into an enforcement or compliance issue, how do you deal with that relative from a state versus USDA program? And then if you are a state and you do decide to go ahead, reach a point to where enforcement and prosecution is your really only option, then you have to jump the hurdle of getting the district attorney to agree to prosecute the case, and sometimes that's not very easy. And so the more that the state vet's office can do to put the case together and lay everything out, and then present it to the district attorney, the better opportunity or the better chance you have of the DA agreeing to pick that up and prosecute. And those were just kind of the points that I wrote down, and I'll pass it on, and then you all can correct me when we're done.
Got a mic?
You got your own?
I do. I have my own. You know what I mean? All right. So Terry, last panel, bringing ADT into reality. First thing to look at there is, I think that's a discussion that that's a question we need to continually ask ourselves as this discussion moves forward. But I also think in this setting, in this time frame that we had set up, certainly could have spent quite a bit more time in relationship to some of the topics that were coming up. But, models that are out there right now, so not only in that panel but also panels previous, I think there was a question of, is there some other example, whether it's another country, private industry, you name it, that we have looked at to make sure that we're not recreating the wheel, to make sure that we're taking advantages from the standpoint of knowing what the mistakes that were made previous in our current system. And a lot of those, to me, tie into data management, working state to state throughout the industry, different types of marketings, those types of things as well. I think one thing that started to come through early this morning, and as we worked through to my session or the panel that I moderated, was there's definitely a need here. Whether this is the right time or not, there's a need that the industry needs to be involved. And when I say industry, I'm thinking of the producer representation. When I think of my membership in Iowa, I think there are several of my leaders and even my local county leaders that are very proactive from an animal disease traceability standpoint. But remember, I reminded you that I've got 10,000 members. And so is that word getting out? Do we truly understand, have we educated well enough, the consequences, the potential consequences if we cannot trace back, whether it's a very serious disease like foot and mouth disease or something that's a bit more common? We talked about brucellosis and TB, and are we accurately being able to do that? Certainly would echo that staying in the phase and perfecting the phase that we're in right now would be an interest from the industry that I've heard here today. Deeper education plan, I already mentioned that, but I think Mr. Starks brought it up really succinctly for me. It's an educational awareness. What's the reason? And if we get to that and we do a good job at that, it will feel less likely or less as a regulatory burden for a producer who ultimately will have to work with this, deal with this one way or another moving forward. Some interconnectivity between states and regions and different types of demographics came up, and I think that as we talk about standards and standardizing data management and data transfer, I think that's really important, and definitely need to delve into that with seeing how other countries have done this, possibly, or other industries within our country have done that. Clarity rings true, and being clear and concise. There were a lot of different success stories shared throughout the day, throughout the Bringing ADT to Reality panel, but can we step back, can we look at those success stories and say, hey, this was a clear opportunity, it was practical, producers, the industry understood it, those types of things. I think those are questions or topics that come up as we move forward. So those are kind of the big pieces that I saw in our panel, bringing ADT into reality. Certainly appreciate and was really impressed by the participation throughout the day in the crowd, whether it was a question or a statement. Very balanced, and that's exciting to me because that tells me that at least from a state and federal government and probably an industry standpoint, we're all engaged in this discussion. That's a big step forward than possibly we've been in the past. So.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Bert. You know, I also represent a trade association, and if we agree on something, it's a pretty unique day. But we do have policy, and I think that policy governs at least our organizations and tries to represent our membership. As we distill that up in the beef industry and national cattlemen's, you know, we struggle over the voluntary, the mandatory piece. And the one thing that occurs to me with this issue, as with all issues, is that participation is usually driven or pulled by things. And nobody likes in our industry to have additional regulation, but it will also yield the highest level of participation. The other option beyond the stick approach is a bit of the carrot approach, and I'll get to that in a little bit, because I think there is some, beyond the pragmatic aspects and the procedural aspects of a traceability program, that there is probably a little bit of time that we ought to evaluate, and this is really for the industry, I think, to do to some extent, evaluate ways to drive participation in programs like this in a more value-added way. You can't do that as agencies necessarily, but I think it's something the industry can consider and should consider. Having been around this issue a number of years ago and having some of the conversations we had then, we're still having some of those, and that's good. But it's also creates a sense of impatience, I think, that we heard today on a repeated level from a variety of sectors. I mean, I know we have people in our organization, we have producers in our organization that are impatient, and we have anchors as well that are pretty happy where they're at. I've reflected a time or two back on my childhood when I was younger, related to associated programs that now have taken on different shapes and terms, be it for brucellosis and tuberculosis, actually coming from a cattle herd and a ranch that had brucellosis at one time when we depopulated those animals, and being very frustrated with that program for a lot of reasons. But today, also understanding how dear that program has been to many producers in the country, because they think it returned a sense of value to them in protection and insurance in order for maintenance of a healthy cattle herd. And I reflect upon that in the sense that we're not trifling with inconsequential things here when we talk about this issue. We're talking about billions and billions and billions of dollars a year. We're talking about situations that if we could manage effectively, really allow us through the backbone, the architecture of a program like this, to be successful in pulling ourselves out of a situation that could be very dire to the industry, and I would argue fairly dire to the country. And we don't take those things on lightly, and that's why we have meetings and discussions like this. So some of the observations, and I'll come back to a little bit of this carrot approach in the end, that I heard today are not indifferent than what everybody has mentioned here already. But, you know, evolution of programs are necessary. Even the existing program the ADT program for over 18-month age of cattle, I think adaptive management is how many in the scientific community would put that when they talk about metrics for managing systems. It's not just the conversation we're having today, but it's the recognition that this is an ongoing, living, evolving program. So if we were to even solve this issue today, we would be at the same table next year having an additional conversation about how to adapt and evolve a program. So we probably need to fit that into the process in some fashion. And I heard that in not necessarily those words, but some undertones as we've moved along today. Speed of commerce is something that it rings true with people. They kind of generally understand what they mean when they say by it. And technology is a key to that. But one thing I heard here a little bit, and I've continually heard around speed of commerce, we used to believe that speed of commerce was a single definition. I think speed of commerce, as we're hearing now, might be different for every sector of the industry and every producer within that sector. And I think we need to remember that as we start talking about technological application or how tags are read and things along those lines, how data is exchanged, that speed of commerce isn't going to be consistent across the board for everybody. They're going to have their own definition of speed of commerce. There are gaps in even the conversation we're having today. I heard a number of people, and those aren't going to be lost because I think we collected that information. Even along the recommendation points, there are gaps. There were gaps alluded to today, and that's why we have conversations like this, is to vet these pieces. And I think it shouldn't go unsaid, because in my understanding of law and of government, it's a fairly significant thing that USDA came here today pre-Federal Register release and provided you with a document to discuss. So we need to show some appreciation for that, because I think that was helpful to today's conversation. And just to remind everybody, that's not for broad distribution, Bert, but I'm just teasing you. But it is for use of this conversation, and I think it's been very helpful. It occurred to me that we're still having one heck of a lot. The largest stack of questions we pulled in today was about ear tags. Not necessarily the functionality of those ear tags, albeit that was in there. A lot of it was about who's going to pay for the ear tag. And I guess I would just ask, as we reflect on this meeting and future discussions, is that the biggest issue? Or is that the immediate discussion point or hurdle that's in front of us, and we need to get forward of that? But it was fairly significant. Technology, at least around data management, I may be wrong in this, but it really occurs to me that we need to spend some sufficient amount of time on figuring this out, because unless I'm incorrect, at least immediately, there's going to have to be an acknowledgement of multiple databases, multiple systems, and we're going to have to find a way, either through human beings. Keith, you mentioned that you're working in 6, 7, whatever amount of databases. So it's either going to be a function of manpower to work within those databases, or we're going to have to make those databases come into discussion with each other. And to oversimplify my comments related to system integration, surely there's somebody that can help us with this, right? I mean, surely there's someone that's a little bit more detailed related to system integration that could dive into that. State law is another issue. It may be that we have to evaluate some of that on an ongoing basis. Again, the industry is going to have to take a leadership role in this. So a message to the industry at the end of the day, we have 2 options with programs as they move forward, or 3, I guess. You kind of let them move forward and develop as they go. This seems to be a rather challenging topic to be able to do that with, at least based on historic performance for some of us. Or we could take the regulatory route, the firm regulatory route. And I think that certainly will drive participation. I don't know that it will drive it at a significantly, at a comprehensive level, but it certainly will drive that. And the reality is that may not be something that anybody is willing to do or support. And if that's the case, if the prior 2 points are things we don't want to consider, I think one of the challenges for the industry, and we heard it repeated today, is that how does the industry or industries move the system if they warrant, and I'll call it a little bit of insurance policy in case of the advent of a disease outbreak, a program like this. And it may be that we need to talk to producers, or the industry may need to figure out how to leverage a little bit of the carrot approach with this. Are there things that and Ross Wilson from Texas Cattle Feeders may or may not be in here now, but he stepped out. Well, you all are responsible for reminding him. He was the first one that brought up, this data needs to be owned by the industry. Well, that's great. And there is a cost with that, et cetera, and those are all things we'll talk about. But maybe that information, the warehousing of that data, could also provide additional goods and services, specifically services to the producers who participate in it. And we actually use a bit of a carrot approach to pull people into the system and be able to use that data in a way that's meaningful for them, but maybe also in a way that in the case of disease outbreak, because of their participation, there's some sort of benefit. And we can talk about what that is, but I believe that firmly rests with the industry to figure out, and is a responsibility of the industry to push that forward, because frankly, I don't know that anybody else can help with that. The industry either has to accept good ideas or come up with good ideas to make that happen. Again, I'll just end with a comment that was made here. There's huge diversity in livestock sectors between producers geographically. We can't change that. We have to accommodate that as much as possible. And these are all points I think many of you said today. I think for the parting moments that we have, and that's looks to be about 10 minutes. What did we miss? If anybody heard something today that we left out, and understand those comments were captured, we'd love to hear from you in the parting few minutes to just make sure that is put on the table for everybody.
We talked about it a little bit. Well, we didn't talk about it in the panel, but right after the panel identified it as an issue that we just ran out of time to bring up in the enforcement panel. But as I pointed out earlier, we deal in Vermont and in New England as a whole with a lot of small sort of niche producers. And I think the question that was posed to our moderator offline in a sidebar conversation is an interesting one, and I think it should be put out there and contemplated, and that is there a size of production facility or scope of producer that is small enough or far out on one extreme or the other enough that the focus should not be placed on that category of producer as far as gaining compliance with traceability. And as we think about that question, I think it's also important to remember that the disease outbreaks that have happened as of late do not discriminate one direction or another. There have been backyard flocks with AI, there have been backyard slash hobby farms and herds with TB, so I struggle with how to bridge that gap, and I think that that's a conversation that at some point needs to happen in a setting like this.
I'm Dr. Rod Hall. I'm the state veterinarian in Oklahoma, and I have a lot of respect for Dr. Tim Starks that was on the previous panel, but and Tim's not here, so I guess it's kind of maybe poor form to disagree with somebody when he's not here, but I'm going to just tell you all that I disagree with Tim's last statement about education. I think education's great, but I don't think education of especially smaller cow-calf producers is going to do any good. I was a mixed animal practitioner for 30 years in southeastern Oklahoma, where the cattle herd size is about like the man from Arkansas said, 20 to 30 head. And I can tell you from being friends and working with those people, they don't go to meetings. They're very, very difficult to educate. It's not that they're not intelligent. It's not that they don't care, but their cattle herds are 4th or 5th in priority on their list. They've got their job in town because they can't make a living off 20 or 30 cows. They've got their family, their church, fishing, whatever it is. And the cattle is really an afterthought. And you can talk to them all day long about what's going to happen if we get foot and mouth disease in the United States. And they're going to understand that's bad, but I just don't think they can translate that into their little operation. They're still going to be able to take their 2 or 3 calves at a time or 10 at a time, and they're still going to be able to sell those at a livestock market somewhere. So I think the industry needs to step up, and those of you industry people, and yeah, I guess it'd be good if there were more of you all in here, but you all represent the greater part of the cattle industry, and I think you all need to take responsibility for those little guys that aren't members of Oklahoma Cattlemen's Association or NCBA, that aren't going to go to their county cattlemen's association meeting. I think the entire industry needs to take responsibility for making the decision that if traceability is important, then we need to go ahead and get on with it. And if it's not, then we need to focus on something else.
I'm Carl Heckendorf from Colorado, and I think this is I may be trying to oversimplify this, but that's typical of me. I think this is a two-pronged approach. We need to put the RFID tags in the calves at the time they're sold. We've established that today. The other thing is we need to let Michael deal with the data and all of the technology stuff and let us cowboys take care of the cows. I mean, it's a two-pronged thing, the technology and putting the ear tags in the calves.
I'm Jim Newald. I'm a pork producer from Illinois. I did find another pork producer here today. I was also involved back with NACE, worked with Neil on that committee, so I'm familiar with a lot of these. The one thing that I think was missed here today that concerns me as a pork producer, it's brought up around the fringe as the big dog, is what if we get something like FMD? So the BSE thing doesn't hit the press like it used to, so it can take a while. I don't know how long. I was going to ask Tony how long that took to trace that one down, going through all those records. But if we have a serious disease, particularly a foreign animal disease that shuts down exports, we don't have time to go through all those records. If we're lucky and catch an index case and the first few after that, more than likely, maybe we can get back to regular business a lot sooner. But that's what I'm not hearing here today, is the urgency and speed that we need to be able to do this tracing.
I can answer the traceability on the cow really quick for you. -1.
-1 days, we knew where the cows. How can that happen? The BSE sample was collected at the stockyard. Okay, so when USDA tells us she was positive, we knew yesterday where she'd come from.
In answer to the FMD thing, unfortunately an FMD outbreak is the 1,000-year flood. And just as so many of us don't bother buying flood insurance because the 1,000-year flood is never going to happen, we're in denial that we're going to face something like an FMD outbreak. I don't know how we get beyond that, but.
What I had to say, this is from Georgia, is that I wanted to add our swine producers here. There's not a lot of mention about swine or poultry or anything else here today. Why? It's because they have a system that's working. They have a system that's working well. And so I think that we need to get on board with the cattle. And the other point I wanted to make was exactly what these guys just made, is that, we talked about TB, we talked about brucellosis, and we talked about BSE. All three of those diseases are not crises. You can take the time to go through the records, and if we wouldn't have the records of our markets, we couldn't even do them. So the markets keep very good records, and that's what we rely upon. Okay? So I praise the markets. But if you have a disease like a very infectious disease, look what happened with PED. Okay? Look what happened with avian influenza. Okay? Look what happened to trade with avian influenza. If those things come, we got to do it now. We can't take days or weeks or whatever, or in some cases with TB, years, and they're still not settled. So we got to move now, and the only way we can do that is we can't wait to 2023. We got to move that thing up and get started a little quicker, and so that and I feel like that I'm for the mandatory. I feel like that we've got to do something now, and we can tweak it later. But we got to do something now, because if you look at, I get a report every month, as does every other state veterinarian, and an hour away is foot and mouth disease all over this world. An hour away is classical swine fever. I mean, this stuff's out there. So don't think those are diseases of the past. They're currently today happening. And so I just want us to protect our industry.
Okay. Well, a few housekeeping chores, but I'll impart a bit of a story, if you humor me for 1 second, about the risk of these discussions. And it began 150 years ago. Our organization's 150 years this year. And our first board of directors in Denver had a conversation. This is pre-marijuana. Had a conversation about tracing cattle and ownership of cattle. And they were the predecessor to the brand law in Colorado. And they hired some range detectives to trace livestock and to figure out what was happening. We thought it was the Texans that were stealing our cattle, but we weren't sure, Ross. So we hired some range detectives to see if still going on today. But we needed to figure that out. So about 6 months later, the range detectives came back into the board of directors of the then Colorado Stock Growers Association and said they had good and bad news. And this is where the risks come in. The good news was they figured out who stole the cattle. The bad news was it was the board president and one of the other board members. So we had a bit of a, there's some risk involved in these discussions, and I don't know where the guy's history went from there, but a bit of color commentary there for the end of the day. What we'd like to do is we're going to get you off of the evening. We'd like to thank our presenters. Everybody did a phenomenal job today.